My name is Kamani Neza Chazi, and I'm the dialogue analyst here at the foundation. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and join us today for this very important conversation, which sits at the very fabric of our society. I've been given the exciting responsibility of being a program director for tonight, which gives me a few powers that I ordinarily wouldn't have. We don't have a very long program for tonight, but we have a rich, short program that I think is going to leave all of us here inspired and give us purpose of what we ought to do to go forward. But before I go into that, I'd like to call up on stage the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Mr. Silo Atang, to welcome us formally so that we can take off our jackets and take in whatever it is that will be given to us today. Over to you, SH.
Thank you very much, Command. Thank you so much for not exercising your powers, because he's capable of embarrassing me from here. So I was grateful that you just handed off. Good evening. Is the mic working? Good evening. Oh, okay. I thought maybe the mic was not working. That's why you were not responsive. But thank you so much for being here tonight. We're really happy to have you here and to kind of be looking at something that we feel is an important matter for South Africa to be dealing with. And I see many familiar faces in the room. Some I saw also the last time we were here together. So I'm really happy that you made it all here tonight. I'm going to ask that you do the acknowledgement of people, if you don't mind, and then I just get into it and get us going. But thank you so much again to the keynote speaker. Thank you for coming through. We're grateful for your presence here. About a year ago, we convened in this same room to mark a year since a very monumental judgment, the Sihlangu versus the Minister of Labour. And the judgment recognized that a provision in the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act of 1993 was unconstitutional. The judgment was, of course, rightly hailed as a significant step forward in the advancement of the status and rights of domestic workers. We convene here again today, a year since our first convening and 2 years since the judgment, to take stock of how far we have come both since the judgment and the last time we convened here. It is no secret, Sis Nomzamo, that the precarious working conditions faced by domestic workers in South Africa are deeply rooted in our colonial/apartheid political and economic legacies. In other words, the confluence of the two continues to exist today. Fundamentally, these conditions seek to enforce the same discriminatory apartheid laws that excluded Black South African women from actively participating in the economy, relegating them to low-income jobs with terrible working conditions where the women had no other options. And I told you last time, and I would like you to indulge me. Last time I told you that I'm a child of a domestic worker myself. My mother was a domestic worker for 40 years. When she retired out of doing this work for over 40 years, she left with nothing but her shoes that she was wearing on her shoes, on her feet, and a jacket that she had to get home, to retire, to nothingness, in other words. So that remains the reality today. So as a child of particularly the person who was illiterate, she couldn't read nor write, she was hardly educated in any way, shape or form, the exploitation that kicks in. So I'm a child of that domestic worker. And I'm proud to say that despite that, she remained very committed to education making sure that we all were committed to making sure that we build a South Africa that's different. So I'm standing here as that child who then is trying to change the trajectory of the other women, the other mothers who tomorrow there shouldn't be another child who says, my mother was once, but rather should say, the conditions were then made possible for my mother not to be. And interestingly, I'm hoping that you'll go into that, the statistics that we have at the moment of how COVID hit that sector particularly. Reading the article yesterday, my heart bled because I know that with us, if my mother didn't have that job, she was a single parent of 6 children. If she didn't have that job, sometimes she just at least had scraps of bread from her bosses that we could have. And I couldn't imagine that if she didn't have that job, what the future would have meant for us as her children. So tragically, what my mother experienced is still being experienced by women here in South Africa. The hyper-racialized, hierarchical, and gendered labor market of our colonial past is still with us in fundamental ways. This is largely tied to the low compliance to laws by employers, a growingly desperate workforce, and the absence of proper monitoring from government. It is in this context that the Sihlangu judgment serves as an important reminder of what still needs to be done if we are to create a just society. Still, the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Amendment Bill is awaiting the President's signature. Knowing that the President is probably watching tonight, we hope that he will hit the call that will be made tonight. This legislation will ensure that domestic workers who were excluded before from occupational benefits such as monetary compensation for injuries and diseases that occurred because of labor get compensated. And this bill is critical to ensuring that the Sihlangu judgment gets legs and can be effectively enforced with proper guiding framework. So colleagues, as we reflect on 2 years since the Sihlangu judgment, it is important that we confront the fact that the transformation of the lives of domestic workers will not happen at the stroke of a pen. In other words, the President's signature is not enough, but requires a continuing collective effort and change of mindset as well. It requires of us to center the voices of domestic workers. In our advocacy and related work, it doesn't matter where we are placed. In other words, it's not the responsibility of SERI or the Nelson Mandela Foundation or the unions which are here, but rather for each one of us to at least be agitating in whichever posting we have in life. Also important to remember is that policies and laws will not implement themselves. They require extensive monitoring actions from us to ensure that they serve their purpose. We are known as the country with the best constitution, the best laws in the world, yet implementation is poor. How do we then change that trajectory and that kind of how we are known around the world as that country? I have to say, this is not a specific area of social justice work that we do as the foundation, but we are always glad to support the important mandates of our partner organizations such as SERI. What I forgot to mention right at the beginning is that Sis Nomzamo is actually my boss. She sits on one of the board committees. You know, when someone sits on the board committee, they can make life difficult, and you know, and so when she says, no, can you host this thing? Like, no, happy to oblige. So thank you again for joining us today, and we're looking forward to the conversation that we're gonna have. I'd like to acknowledge tonight the South African Domestic Service and Allied Workers Union, the United Domestic Workers of South Africa, the Izwi Domestic Workers Alliance. I think with these kind of alliances, I thought I should leave them last to say that together with SERI, they are not enough to change the lives of domestic workers. So each one of us should try and do our best to change that life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atang, for that warm welcome. I was waiting for you to just go beyond 5 minutes by 1 second to exercise my powers.
Oh, sorry.
I'll have to wait until next time. But thank you for also reminding us of the intergenerational challenges that are faced by domestic workers and the monumental task that lies ahead for us today. Now that we've been welcomed officially, I would like also to call Sis Nomza Mozondo from the Socio-Economic Rights Institute to just explain to us why we are here today and to also refresh our memories. Perhaps someone RSVP'd 2 weeks ago and they've forgotten why they are here. So Sis Nomza.
Thank you so much, Kamani. I'm just going to abuse my power as well. So my younger brother is friends with Kamani. So the first time I came to a subcommittee meeting, he calls like, your sister is here. What's this Nomzam? What's this Nomzam? What's this Nomzam? So always when I see him, I just see my younger brother and I get very excited. So this, a lot of power. Firstly, just thanks to all of you for being here. And thanks, Selo, for that great welcome. I think whenever I think of the work that SERI does, Selo, it feels like the mic can't hear me, like they've made it your height. They've made it my height. I hope everyone can hear me.
They can, yeah.
Okay, great. So whenever I think of the Sihlangu judgment, in fact, whenever I think of SERI's work, I always think that this judgment singularly is the biggest thing that SERI has ever done on its own, before anything else. Because on the 19th of November 2020, almost 1 million domestic workers became protected from workplace injury. On that day, before Ramaphosa signed a law, before a minister agreed, on that day, immediately, that coverage happened. And on that very same day, there was a possibility that any domestic worker who has been injured, became ill, or even died, would be able, if they had not died, would be able to bring a claim for what had happened to them. Or if they had died, then their dependents could claim for the loss. That all happened on the 19th of November. But with that said, immediately when I think of the impact of the judgment, I immediately temper my excitement. Because on the 13th of June, we asked the Compensation Fund, we asked them to tell us what has happened since the judgment. And they told us that by that time, they'd only received 7 claims. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And in those 7 claims, they count the claim brought by the Sihlangu family, which fought this case. And they said to us, in that 7, they have accepted 5 claims. And we're immediately worried. Because after all that excitement, after all the big announcements, after all the celebrations, to only have 7 claims as at the 13th of June 2022 just does not make sense. But then they also said something else. They said they have started receiving contributions from the employers of domestic workers. And they said as at that time, they'd received 1,677 contributions. In this country, because of COVID, we've gone from having over 1 million domestic workers to 800,000. So that 1,600 is not even a percent. It means that 99% of employers of domestic workers are not contributing to the fund as of today. And that's why we invited all of you. We've invited all of you here because we believe that we need, Selo, to form our tribe, which is going to make sure that the judgment is realized, that it actually reaches real people's lives. And when we actually thought of having the very first lecture, Kele came to my office and said, "This is the idea that we have. What do you think?" And I said, "We need a big name behind this." Because at every stop, where we've attempted to engage the media, we've been ignored. We need a big name to stand with us when we have this annual lecture. And that is why we approached the foundation. Nelson Mandela is the biggest name in South Africa. Some might even argue it's the biggest name in the world. And we are grateful, Selo, that when we came and knocked on your door and you said, "Can you partner with us in this lecture?" you agreed. But today I'm here to plead for more partnerships. And I'm grateful that I'm here in the room and I can say we have the Women's Legal Center, who was with us in the Sihlangu case, here saying we want to walk the journey with you, Dosa, with Satsao, with Izwi, with other organizations that are working with domestic workers. To have in the room the Black Womxn Caucus, to say every woman counts. First of all, it must be repeated that the domestic work sector is the biggest employer of Black women. And to have the Black Womxn Caucus here to say we want to work with SERI, to work with the unions on this issue, says to us we are feminists supporting this agenda. But it's also more important to acknowledge that government has been willing. In the second lecture, in the first lecture, we invited the Minister of Labour to attend. He accepted the invitation, but on the eve of the lecture, he was summoned to Parliament, to the Portfolio Committee to come and account. And in the office we had a joke that, he's probably decided he doesn't want to talk to us, doesn't want to talk to domestic workers. And then the next morning I remember seeing the article covering his interviews with the Portfolio Committee. And I said, okay, so government is serious about this sector. They're serious about us. But the question then still remains, with all of those people mentioned, how is it that we only have 7 claims? Because I'm certain that there's simply no way that there has even been less than 100 domestic workers injured between 1994 April and 13 June 2022. That just can't be the case. And when we were thinking about this, one of our own experiences, Sis Pinky, in doing this work, is how the media has refused to engage with this issue. You remember when we won in the High Court in Pretoria, we issued a press release. It was mostly ignored. And we figured at the time, because I think it was the return of the World Cup, and Siya Kolisi was going around with the cup, so we thought we'd been drowned out by the Rugby World Cup victory. When we won in the Constitutional Court, it was the very same experience. And we couldn't really have an explanation of why we're being ignored. And then in February of 2021, the Compensation Fund and the department announced that they would have a deadline. They would set a deadline for November 2021 for anyone who wanted to submit a claim. And we felt that would be an injustice to many domestic workers who probably don't even know they're entitled to claim. And we started engaging the Compensation Fund about that deadline, and they agreed to extend it. But still, we're not getting any attention from the media on this issue. And unfortunately, even though when we're having those challenges in 2021, we're able to convince Ayabonga Tawe to give us a month's space in the Shop Stewards Corner in August 2021. Even this week, when we sent a press release about this event, we only received 4 responses. There are 2 journalists who are supposed to be in the room. We're invited to speak with the ENCA, and then we're invited to speak on power. 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. On an issue that affects 800,000 employees, on an issue that is clearly an issue about poor Black women. And when I'm glad that she's here, one of our funders, a representative is here, Fatima Shabodin. When we were discussing this issue with her, she said, Nomzama, the problem with domestic work is that there's no monster. There's no big bad wolf that all the Ghanaians can be pointed at. It's all of us. We are the problem. And because of that, we are here. So I'm here today to plead with you. In this opening, where I thought I would acknowledge people, and that's what I told him. But I'm here to plead with you, to say wherever you are, first in your own home, if you have a domestic worker, comply, register for UIF, register for COIDA. Within your family, within your friends, engage about the rights of domestic workers. For those who are influencers on Twitter, on Facebook, with their 30,000 followers, please, let's have this debate. The Forge is here. We need support on this. We need to support the work that Pinky started, right? To make sure that domestic workers are covered. Because what's going to happen next is that government is going to say there isn't enough money to cover domestic workers because there's no one is contributing. So we need this issue to reach every single person. And lastly, to close, before Kamani reminds me that he's not my younger brother. He's the program director here. We brought this case with Sylvia Mahlangu, with the support of Pinky and Satsao. So I can't really sit down without acknowledging Satsao. But I think it's also a very important time for us to acknowledge Myrtle Witbooi, who is the GS of Satsao, who has been struggling with ill health, but to say to her, your work is remembered in this room. And we send you healing vibes, and we send you all of our love. And to say to the domestic workers sector more generally, that you might feel alone and itemized in your workplace. But there are thousands and thousands of women, organizations, and even departments who stand with you. Thank you.
It's always so difficult to speak after someone mentions numbers because I don't have statistics to pull out. But I think we can all agree that the fact that there's only been 7 claims and only 5 of them have been paid out in 2 years really paints a bleak picture of how bad the situation is. And also how only at 1,000 and something domestic workers has been registered in a country that has over 500,000, 800,000 to be exact. There's also another painful reminder of how all of society needs to be involved, but somehow we are all not playing our role. It reminds us of a bigger question of what do we think of the collective responsibility we all have to the Black family, to the Black woman, to the Black child, because this is their story as much as it's the story of the domestic workers themselves. I'm just going to go into our program for today, but before I do that, I'd like to start with some housekeeping rules. The bathrooms are on your left as you exit the door. There's also a water dispenser there if you need to get some water and you didn't get some on your way in here. I'd also like to ask that we keep our phones on silent. If you can't put it on silent, switch it off. You can switch it on later. And no vibrate, off or silent. And also, when I reflect back on the judgment and the first time I heard of the case, I thought to myself, brilliant news. Stuff is going to change. But we sit here today and we hear that nothing has changed. And we have a panel of discussants today who's going to help us understand, perhaps, what is it that has made it so difficult for change to occur? How have we been complicit in change not occurring? And also simultaneously remind us of how we can galvanize the support of the people in this room, the support of the communities, the support of people out there to ensure that we get to a point where the judgment doesn't just become a piece of something written on a piece of paper, but becomes something that is implementable and will help us to get forward and to change the lives of these domestic workers. So I'm quite excited to hear what comes out for today. We're going to have a keynote address by Seeham Samaai, who's going to touch on this very important issue, but perhaps also offer her insights as to what are some of the things that she has picked up and also some of the things that she would like us to understand, which will lay a fertile ground then for our panel discussants to talk to her issue. But I also hope that we use this time to also listen attentively and begin to ask the difficult questions. I don't think we're going to get to a point where we know what we have to do if we do not ask it today. So please, if there's questions, let's ask them. I'll be very friendly with the time for questions when it comes, just so we can leave here knowing what it is that we have to do, because it's not enough to just come in here and listen. We need to leave here knowing what it is that we have to do. So I have the pleasure of inviting our keynote speaker for today, Seeham Samaai. I'm going to read her bio. It was very long, but thanks to Kelly, we've managed to make it shorter, just to save time. So Seeham is a feminist lawyer and activist who has been practicing as an attorney for over 20 years. She was a BProc LLM from the University of the Western Cape. She's the director of the Women's Legal Center, an African feminist legal center that advances women's rights and equality through strategic litigation, advocacy, education, advice, and training. The Women's Legal Center is a vision of women in South Africa who enjoy equal and substantive access to rights, and its objective is to drive a feminist agenda and develop feminist jurisprudence based on an intersectional approach and with substantive equality as its foundation. Seeham was the Director of Legal Administration in the Western Cape Regional Office of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, and she previously worked for the Foundation for Human Rights and their Strengthening of Civil Society and Access to Justice program. She was also a lecturer and director of the UWC Law Clinic, where she practically trained law students and candidate attorneys within a clinical law environment with the aim of insulating principles of social responsibility and social justice. She's a long-serving board member and chairperson of Lawyers for Human Rights and previously served on the Rural Legal Trust and Association of University Legal Aid Institutions and Trust. We are very grateful to have you here, Seeham, and we look forward to hearing some of your insights. Thank you.
Nomzamo, I can see the mic. Thank you very much. I know that I'm a bit on the short side, so I'll just. Good evening, all. I just want to say, firstly, I want to start off by thanking the Nelson Mandela Foundation, the Institute, and the Socio-Economic Rights Institute. Can I stand here?
You can use this one of these mics. We want to see you.
You want to see me? I'm going to do it here. For creating a space where we can engage on issues such as the Sihlangu. You can't?
Is the mic not on?
So our Constitution and Bill of Rights has often been touted as one of the most inclusive in the world. Its value is not just in its hopes and morals and values and ideals enshrined, but also by engaging in key critical issues that affect us all. Legal challenges are but one part that turns the well-intentioned words of our Constitution and Bill of Rights into an actionable document as seen in this particular case, but also in terms of many other matters. But what I will be speaking about is the impact of the casualization and feminization of labor on all vulnerable workers. The dawn of our constitutional democracy earmarked a commitment to gender-based approach to developing jurisprudence and legislation on women's rights. These include, but are not limited to, the 1996 Constitution that contains a Bill of Rights with an equality clause and specifically prohibits unfair discrimination on grounds of gender, sex, and sexual orientation. But this constitutional foundation has been followed through in subsequent pieces of legislation, such as the Employment Equity Act, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, and by the ratification of the South African government on the United Nations Covenant on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. And there were many others, like the ILL, the labor relations, sexual harassment, various amendments that have been done. We've come to learn that formal equality is simply not sufficient to give effect to real change. Considering the historical context of South Africa of racial inequity and gender segregation, these forms of discrimination continue to coexist in our present society. So the workplace is but a microcosm of our society, and so we find that our societal reality is ever present within the sector where women in particular face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. Since its inception, the Women's Legal Center has been advocating for the rights and protection of vulnerable workers in the workplace. There is much to be said about the current struggles of women in South Africa, where we find that the unequal gender and power relations lead to the marginalization and vulnerability of women, and socioeconomic drivers continue to leave Black women in the most vulnerable position in society. We still find gender disparities in terms of employment, where women can only occupy or only occupies 1 in 3 managerial positions and even fewer senior positions. Furthermore, the women who do occupy managerial and senior positions are still largely white. Black women make up a large part of the poor and the working class, and they are locked in cycles of poverty. They are bound to casual labor where they are paid the least but work the longest hours. For women, casualization of labor impacts on their rights to organize, on their family life, as well as their vulnerability to sexual violence in the workplace. We recognize also that the impact of intersectionality on women's work experiences and acknowledge the struggles faced by all vulnerable workers, which includes farm workers, migrant workers, domestic workers, sex workers, health workers, and we lesbian, bisexual, transgender women and women from both rural and urban areas. This includes unfair discrimination, which includes emotional, verbal, physical abuse, manipulation by employers, sexual harassment, and more. So while our Constitution addresses workers' rights, the realization of these rights on the ground are often not sufficiently met and implemented. There is still much to be done in achieving substantive equality with regard to women's rights in the workplace. According to Stats South Africa, women account for 40 to 45% of all employment and hours worked in South Africa, and at last count contributed 1.2 trillion to the country's GDP. Despite this, women workers in South Africa are still more likely to be paid less than men and are far more likely than their male counterparts to experience sexual harassment and violence while at work. In fact, 77% of women in South Africa have experienced sexual harassment at some point during their working lives. So the Women's Legal Center is constantly approached by women who experience some form of discrimination in the workplace. These women work in different spaces and perform work that is either recognized outside of their home or engage in unpaid care work. Too many work in precarious working conditions in private homes or on privately owned farms, or as part of our informal economy, applying their trade at taxi ranks and as street corners as street traders. We therefore recognize that discrimination against women takes many different forms, and because places of work are mere were dismissed. The state, however, did not take into account that the majority of domestic workers have not been registered by their employers as such, and therefore are unable to access social security benefits when no contribution or no registration was effected by the employers. Another category of vulnerable workers is women who work on farms. These women are particularly at risk as they work through stage 5 lockdown in the agricultural sector that did not provide them with personal protective equipment. Seasonal farm workers who in the exploitative agricultural sector are often not afforded recognition as employees. And we saw this during lockdown, where they were not registered as employees, and when the government implemented the temporary employment relief scheme, these workers were completely excluded from the social security benefit as farm owners refused to apply for benefits on their behalf or on behalf of the seasonal farm workers because they were not the employer. It was the labor broker. The restriction on people's right to work where they were not employed in the essential services sector meant that food security was threatened in many, many homes. So whilst in the global north, they are talking about a post-COVID world or a COVID recovery, we in the global south are still faced with the harsh reality of the impact of COVID on our daily lives, but also on our economy. We will continue to feel the impact for some time to come, and the pressures of everyday life. Working in a feminist environment means that we need to be proactive. Therefore, our work is focused on ensuring that our legislative and policy framework ensures that there's a just and equitable work environments for women, especially those women who work in vulnerable and precarious working environments, like domestic work, like farm work, like sex work. These women work in particular precarious conditions, and they were privately owned farms where there's little oversight or accountability, and they are far removed from access to resources to vindicate their rights. Many women also form part of the South Africa's informal economy, applying their trade at taxi ranks and on street corners, and healthcare workers within their communities. It is important to view women's work through the historical context of apartheid legacy, which created and maintained systems that continue to disproportionately impact on women. Considering the racial sexist biases that affect dynamics in the workforce, African Black women in particular face discrimination in a compounded and intersectional manner. It is also through this patriarchal view of women that the labor traditionally performed by women and perceived as women's work is dismissed, it's undervalued, and it is underpaid. So South Africa's economy is built on the backs of the working class women who need to provide for their families. The deregulation of labor markets, fragmentation of production processes, deindustrialization of work have all generated an increased demand for low-paid, flexible, casual female labor. Furthermore, informal activities, subcontracting, part-time work, home-based work have proliferated while rates of unionization have declined. And so in South Africa, standard labor legislation has applied to fewer workers because governments have not enforced or abolished it, or because enterprises have circumvented or bypassed legislation, like labor brokers, who have de-linked housing from labor in relation to farm workers. And so we have many, many farm workers that cannot be classified as ESTA occupiers, which is a massive challenge. But let's not forget, Many of these workers remain mothers, they remain sisters, they remain care workers, and there's little evidence that women's increased involvement in paid work has significantly reduced poor women's share of unpaid work in caring for households. So the cost of raising children, how the labor force is reproduced and maintained, how society protects vulnerable groups, all relate to the women's gender-ascribed caring roles and affect how paid markets work. Along with the decreased social provisioning by the state, liberalization as well as privatization have shifted the cost of the social production from the paid to the unpaid economy. So what we have seen is, with considerable evidence of negative consequences for women's health, women's well-being, and for the total household welfare. When women work for meager income, girls may be taken out of school to help with household work, increasing their chances of being poor in the future. And this is the intergenerational challenges that we need to deal with. Structural discrimination, which is present in our homes, communities, and places of work, all contribute to the lack of recognition assigned to women's unpaid care work. Discrimination within the current economic value chain leads to men being paid more than women in the labor markets outside of their homes, leaving women dependent on their male counterparts within their family units for their financial well-being, while they carry out the unpaid care work. Through this dependence, women become vulnerable to violence. A woman who is experiencing domestic violence from a partner whom she is financially dependent on while carrying out unpaid care work is reluctant to seek help against a partner while she is left financially vulnerable. It is important to recognize that the role that patriarchy and discrimination plays in how women are viewed, their contribution to the household, the economic value in their work, and the stereotypes that are present within our communities. We also need to recognize the intersectionality and privilege, as women are not homogeneous in this country, and women experience different forms experience discrimination in very different ways. Our reality is that Black women are all at the coalface of poverty, and so the lack of recognition given to their unpaid care work directly compounds their discrimination, which impacts on their ability to access their right to health, right to housing, right to land, and right to education. Statistics South Africa indicate that Black African women spend the most time on unpaid care work, doing 4 hours 53 minutes on average on unpaid care work, while Black African males, the highest amount on time spent on unpaid care work, only spend 105 minutes on unpaid care work. Government has a critical role to play here to ensure access to maternity leave and benefits for employed and self-employed women in all sectors, and that leave provisions are extended to men to ensure that they meet their parental responsibilities. We also need to examine how government can reduce care responsibilities by taking over some of the responsibilities in respect of childcare through properly regulating and accessible free early childhood development centers. This relates to a resource allocation issue, and focused attention also needs to be given to the implementation of quality, effective government services which impacts on sexual and reproductive rights. Because this, if done efficiently, it would enable women to make informed decisions on family planning and contraception. Access to water and sanitation, which is often overlooked in urban areas, have a critical influence on women carrying out unpaid care work in rural areas and informal settlements. Due to a lack of service, They have to carry out unnecessary additional labor which could be avoided if there were adequate services available. It is far too often that issues which are overlooked and not deemed urgent are those that, if addressed, can have a lasting effect on women. These are some of the examples of how the lack of access to socio-economic rights within a context directly impacts on women's unpaid and paid work and continuous cycles of poverty that trap women and girls. The time has come for us to have an open conversation about unpaid care work and its true impact on women's rights to substantive equality. The implementation of gender policies in workplaces in South Africa has been slow, and the persistent marginalization of women in trade unions and other workplaces in South Africa requires us to pause and to investigate the disconnect between law and policies and practice. According to Stats SA, the unions with a higher proportion of female membership still have a low representation at National Executive Committee level. Almost half, 48% of union members are women. But at National Executive Committee level, only 30% of the leaders are women, while female representation at the level of national office bearers is 29%. For example, many young female workers in the retail and hospitality, security, domestic sectors lament the low wages, the late working hours, and the unsafe transportation. So in the education sector, the long working hours and the dual roles are also taking its toll on female teachers. Now, the challenge that we are sitting with is these are critical issues that needs to be taken up by our trade unions. The socioeconomic and other challenges affecting marginalized and poor workers in South Africa are almost the same, and this ought to give impetus to our understanding of why civil society and trade unions need to work collectively together. We have a big responsibility to build an inclusive, affirming, and non-violent work environments. Thus, our organizations must commit to improving information sharing and proven strategies for bringing about equity and transformation in the workplace. We can't afford any longer to engage in petty politics between civil society and the unions. We are all here to ensure that workplaces are safe and decent, and while we are doing this, we are still facing the fourth industrial revolution, informalization, and increasing incidences of harassment, intimidation, and violence. There's a necessity for us to work together. So for women, it is not yet uhuru, and the fight must continue. Civil society should intensify its work within trade unions and worker organizations like the Casual Workers Union and participate in those projects aimed at protecting worker rights in the workplace. We must also continue efforts for creating and maintaining social dialogue as a real mechanism for coordinating the interests of all our social partners with the active participation and women and youth organization, including your trade unions and your domestic worker unions. So as Nelson Mandela has said, this is my final comment, this is not the final step of our journey, but the first step on a longer and even more difficult road. It is a journey to dismantle patriarchy. It's a journey to dismantle patriarchy and capitalist interests, which impacts on the lived realities of vulnerable women. It is a journey which gives effect to substantive equality for all vulnerable workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Seeham, for that moving address, and for just reminding us how the issue of domestic workers' rights offers us a broader insight into the general struggles of women in the workplace in South Africa, and that by changing it, it has an impact on us standing a greater chance of redressing the gendered makeup of our economy and the job market in South Africa. I also like the fact that you reminded us that the legislative environment is fertile and allows for the collective responsibility for all of us to play in ensuring that this comes to fruit. But the biggest question is, how do we plant the necessary seeds then in that fertile legal environment to ensure that what is written on paper becomes actionable outcomes that can lead to change for the lives of domestic workers? And to help us answer those questions, we have a very beautiful panel that will join us, facilitated this evening. I'm just trying to find my notes. You will forgive me. It's difficult to find your notes after such a moving address. Thank you. We have a moving panel which will be facilitated by Keitumetse Moutloatse just now for us. But before she does that, I'd like to give a brief introduction as well of a CV. We've tried to cut these people's CVs short, or else we'll be here the whole day reading their bios. Keitumetse is a feminist social worker and social development practitioner with an honors degree in social work from the University of the Witwatersrand. She's currently pursuing a master's degree in social development at the University of Witwatersrand. She's the founder and chairperson of the Black Womxn Caucus, a social movement that uses feminist popular culture and education to advocate against gender-based violence and its manifestations on a micro, meso, and macro level. Under her leadership, Black Womxn Caucus has grown exponentially from a university-based movement to a national movement with a continental and international footprint. Black Womxn Caucus has pioneered some of the most pivotal moments in shifting GBVF discourse in South Africa, including the historic hashtag the total shutdown and the hashtag Sentin shutdown. Keitumetse is recognized as part of the Mail and Guardian 200 Young People for 2020 under the category of civil society. She has been recently named top 100 influential young South Africans by Advanced Media Group for 2020. I think it's safe to say that we are in safe hands, Keitumetse, so over to you.
Can I ask for my panelists to join? I can be very awkward with protocol, so.
Wenukhalela sizochika izinto wenukhalela domestic workers, long live! Long live! Long live domestic workers, long live! Long live! Long live working class women of South Africa, long live! Long live! Long live working class women of South Africa, long live! Long live! Long live working class women of Africa, long live! Long live! Long live working class women of Africa, long live. Long live. Amandla. Awethu. Amandla. Amandla. Awethu. 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 Awethu. Amandla. No, you're not fair about two. Good evening, colleagues, comrades. Keitumetse Fatimata Moutloatse. It is really such an honor to be a part of this process. I think when the invite came from SERI and the Nelson Mandela Foundation, the first thing I had to do was to locate myself in the historical process of this Keitumetse journey. As introduced, Keitumetse Fatimata Moutloatse. I'm a social worker, I'm an activist, a social development practitioner, the chair and founder of Black Womxn Caucus. Hi, Marana Kiratam Zabalauz. Wherever you find me, just know I'm protesting. Whatever context, I'm protesting. And even here tonight, I believe we are engaging in some kind of protest. The reason why I was insisting that we started by singing is because sometimes when we listen to the realities that we find ourselves in, it's very easy to become disempowered, to feel like, hey man, getting shut down, we've been mobilizing, we've been marching, Mom Pinky, we've been rolling on the ground, but things just don't seem to get better. And when we sing, we remind ourselves that things will turn. We sit here on the back of Maria Sihlangu, who tragically passed away 10 years ago this year. In 2012, she unfortunately lost her life at her place of work. A Black woman who had worked for a particular family for over 2 decades, lost her life at her place of work, and there was zero recognition of that. Now, when listening to the very profound keynote address, I somewhat located myself in the experiences of domestic workers. And when Nomzamo says that we must be intentional about not leaving any women behind, I also resonated with that too. Because we find ourselves in a very interesting time where capitalism has killed any kind of possible, genuine, sustainable solidarity, specifically amongst women. Capitalism has sold us this lie that just because you are not the one who are wearing the overall, washing dishes, that you are better off. Capitalism gives us the false sense of illusion just because you are the one who has been fortunate, who's probably the employee, falls part of that 1,000 plus, who contributes to this fund that the issue of domestic workers is no longer mine. And so today we are here to remind ourselves, 2 years ago, a historic judgment was passed by the highest court in the land that recognizes domestic workers as full workers and they have access to all worker rights. But most importantly, we need to understand and unpack what these judgments mean, right? I always say, see this high level thinking sometimes, hey, it loses me. And it's always important to bring it back to our people. I'm joined by a phenomenal panel, as you can see. We are really trying to emphasize and bring forth the idea of collective responsibility. And this is why we have representatives. We have Mam Pinky, a force, a Keida, a groundist. We have a development partner, Jackie, who unfortunately was unable to join us due to technical challenges, but we still do acknowledge her willingness to participate from the UN Women. We have Chrissy, a dynamic woman. It's my first time meeting you, but the work of the Legal Center is one that I've followed for years and has informed a lot of our activism as young activists in this room. And I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. Yeah, don't be jealous, clap. Clap. We are speaking equality after all. And then we have Nokuthula. I know there's a lot of pressure on you walking into this room. Everyone wants to hear what the government has to say, but also you become a strategic partner and stakeholder in advancing not only the cause of domestic workers in South Africa, but I just think the plight of all working class women in this country. So welcome. Colleagues, comrades rather, I start off just by briefly reflecting on the keynote address and some of the standout commentary that was made. You know, we often think about the casualization and feminization, and those words might sound very big and complicated, but it just means the precarious and the unstable nature of the workforce. Something that's not only happening in South Africa, but we're seeing it as a global phenomenon. And we see that this kind of new labor we want to call, unfortunately, is where Black women are concentrated in. But we also need to understand that when we speak about the makeup of the labor force, it is not just a standalone process. Because as rightfully said by our keynote address, our places of work are an extension of society. So the same issues we find there in the workplace, I can guarantee you today, we're going to find them in our society. So it's imperative that when we think around the workforce, when we think around challenging the narrative and discourse on care work and the experiences of domestic workers, comrades, we're not just speaking about domestic workers. We are speaking about a radical stance that we need to take as people in this room to ensure that we see transformative change in the makeup of our society at an economic, political, environmental, and social level. So I really want to urge you, when you are thinking around the experiences that is domestic workers, that you elevate the thinking, hanyani, it's bigger than us. With that being said, I would like to give it off to Mam Pinky. Because I am program director, I will read these very short bios, or rather they've shortened them, excuse my language. Mam Pinky is the president of the United Domestic Workers of South Africa. She is a unionist and a labor rights activist, advocating for domestic worker rights. As an organizer, Mam Pinky discovered the plight of the Sihlangu family in 2012 and assisted the Sihlangu family obtain legal representation. Throughout the Sihlangu matter, Pinky participated in media advocacy on the inclusion of domestic workers in COIDA. Pinky is an Atlantic Fellow for Racial Equity, participating in the 2020 fellowship cohort. Thank you and welcome. Mam Pinky, I just want to trigger you hanyane, because I think often in experience is the ultimate teacher. As a domestic worker, you are in the best position to contextualize what does COIDA mean, the progress that has been made since the passing of the judgment, or rather the lack of, even in terms of progress. And as a domestic worker, what is your assessment of where we are? And I say this because just last year, we were organizing for a case of Mam, I just want to confirm her name, Mam Kabonina Mkwanza, who was brutally attacked by her employer and his son. And what does that tell us about where we are? in the movement for the protection and recognition of domestic workers in this country.
Good evening. It is an honor to be here to sit among these lovely people that I'm looking at this moment. I have seen Mama Eunice. I'm so happy to see Mama Eunice. Yes, there she is. Yes. Away too. Yeah, Mama Eunice. We are good tonight. Eating pumela. I want to thank Nelson Mandela Foundation and Socio-Economic Rights Institute, SERI. Nelson Mandela Foundation is my home, and I also don't want to talk much about that. And I'm happy to be home. You know, when you are home, you are so relaxed. And the advantage of being home is that nobody will beat you up or attack you at your home. You've got all the weapons because you are home. So I'm that comfortable where I am here. Case of Maria Sihlangu came a long way. Satsao, Izwi, Black Womxn Caucus, Shais Fuba, yes, Shais Fuba, Pretoria High Court. But to be honest, I'm happy about the Constitutional Court ruling, but there's still a long way to go. To be honest, many employers haven't got enough information that they need to know more about COIDA. Many domestic workers haven't got information from us as unions. We must tell the truth. We are not well resourced to reach all domestic workers. I've started with the COIDA awareness campaign this year. I have already reached 5 provinces. There's still 4 provinces. And in those 5 provinces, there are domestic workers who are calling and say, please come back. What did you say about that COIDA? Domestic workers want to hear more. Employers, there are employers who are willing to comply with the law. Let me tell you, there are good employers out there. They just need education. And it will be a mistake as unionists if we can say we don't need employers, we need domestic workers, because they are not domestic workers if there are no employers. So we need both domestic workers as much as we need employers. We need Department of Labor. Sometimes I have fought with some officials at the Department of Labor, but I make sure that I don't burn the bridges, because I'll need to go back to Labor Department when I have cases, because the laws that we have as unions are the laws from them. I am concerned. Why is the President hasn't signed COIDA Amendment Bill? I'm happy that Compensation Fund Commissioner included domestic workers in 2021 on the 10th of March. He signed on the 10th of February, and then it was gazetted on the 10th of March. We appreciate that. That's an assurance that we are covered by COIDA. But we want insurance. COIDA is an insurance that domestic workers never had before, and we deserved it. It was long overdue. Why is the President not signing? We still know, I want to say it, I'm happy that there's media here, that President doesn't take us domestic workers seriously. We have seen that during the time of COVID-19, when he was addressing the nations, we had many problems with domestic workers. Others were refused to fetch their medications. Others were locked against their will by the employers in their properties. We sent petitions. We wrote to the President. We never got responses. In his national address, he never spoke about domestic workers. I listened to all of them attentively. He spoke about petrol attendants, nurses, and forgetting that domestic workers are essential workers. Domestic workers are taking care of your treasure employers, your houses, your children. You don't want anyone to know your house. You don't want any stranger, even criminals, to know your house. But you trust domestic workers to look after your houses. And I haven't heard, though I have heard few cases, we must be honest here, of domestic workers committing crimes against their employers. But I haven't heard of a domestic worker who poisoned the whole family of her employers, even if they are treated badly and cruel by the employers, because their mothers, they care and they love so much. They look after the aged, the sick children. When the employers cannot handle their children, they'll say, Pinky, where are you? We are always there for them. And leaving our families, I leave my children in Mpumalanga to see for themselves. But I make sure that my employers' children are taken care of every day, including the president. When is Koida Amendment Bill going to be signed into law? That's what we are waiting for. And we are not going to be shy to say this, that we are not happy. If the government doesn't take us serious, that will promote non-compliance to the employers who don't want to comply. It must be the government that lead by example. Actually, all the ministers, we need the names of their domestic workers and their addresses. We want to invite them to our meetings. Yes. So, to have Koida working for domestic workers, we need everyone here. If you have a relative who's got a domestic worker at home, speak to them. Take this information, share information. Domestic work is the biggest sector. If it was organized, it's very unfortunate that is the most vulnerable sector, most neglected sector, and most ignored sector. But we are the biggest sector in South Africa. Saying more than 800,000 domestic workers, I can say even we reach the 1 million, because they are domestic workers, those you call Abu Auntie. And we don't want to hear that word again, because we are not treated like real aunties, the real family aunties. I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm the first one to bath your children. I'm the last one to sleep at 11 o'clock. Then you'll say, Auntie, Auntie what? I'm not treated like auntie. When does auntie rest? When is auntie off? When is auntie going to take a family out? When am I going to meet auntie's family? Do all employers know where their domestic workers come from? Maybe if you can go to their homes, then you'll understand their plight. Then you'll register them with the UIF. You'll register them with the Koida. Domestic workers were hit hard by COVID-19. They were not registered with TERS Fund. Many of them didn't benefit from TERS Fund, and it's a serious issue. Let us all make Koida to work for domestic workers. They deserve it. And I ask all employers who are here, and to tell your friends as well, that please comply with the law. As unions, we promise to produce good domestic workers to you.
Yes, thank you. Malibongwe. Igama lamakhosikazi. Thank you, Ma'am Pinky. I think there's some very interesting points that have been raised here, and they usher us quite nicely into Chrissy's segment. You know, the issue of access to information is a massive barrier when we think about the implementation of laws and even just more broadly compliance. And when Ma'am Pinky says we need to capacitate unions with the right support for them to also educate their members about Koida, that is an important aspect and an area of intervention. You spoke about it, that we need to see stronger solidarity between civil society organizations and unions, because it's very difficult to hold someone accountable if you do not have the right information. Right? And so what I'm hearing now, because we also need to think about solutions, Pelane, what I'm hearing now is that we need a public education advocacy campaign that speaks about Koida, you know, that ensures that not just domestic workers, but even the employers are aware of what is expected from them, you know, because we can't keep signing things, comrades, and not knowing. It just does not make sense. We need to equip domestic workers with the right information, because part of your tool of trade, because we always assume tool of trade is just a mop and a petticoat, but also having the right information about your job and what is expected from you, but also what is expected from your employer is a critical intervention that we need to look into. And Chrissy, I really want to touch that, you know. I want to read your bio real quick, but I want you to think about this gap that we see between, so we all understand we've got a very enabling and progressive legislative environment in the country. But on the one end, we have super poor implementation. But also, maybe that could be because, number one, we don't understand the law. But number two, we might not feel that the law speaks to our experiences. And so, when I think about the law, when I think about a case like Maria Sihlangu, and I think about the intersecting oppressions that a case like that, an individual like that is subjected to, I really want to probe you on that. But before you do respond, I will read. Chriscy Blouws is a social justice and gender activist, a human rights lawyer who obtained her LLB from the University of the Western Cape. Chriscy is currently employed at the Women's Legal Center as an attorney working on women's rights to work in favorable and just conditions in the workplace, which is free from sexual harassment and violence. In addition, she works on women's rights to be free from violence in society at large, in particular, the right of women to publicly name their perpetrators. And she works to create a feminist jurisprudence which recognizes the systematic failures and lived realities of women in South Africa in the goal to achieve a substantive equality for women.
Thank you.
I told you, comrades, we can't be greedy with the claps. You may proceed.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having us as part of this dialogue. Can you hear me clearly? Is that better? Good evening, everyone. So I think I'm going to start off exactly where you ended. And the question really touches on lived reality. And that was the importance, or what the Women's Legal Center sought to contribute to the case of Sihlangu before the Constitutional Court. When we sought to intervene before the Constitutional Court as a friend of the court, we sought to do this intervention to bring to the court the lived reality and the context, because what you've highlighted and what Sis Pinky has highlighted is that we may have wonderful laws, formal equality, because they are there on paper. But in reality, Sis Pinky has highlighted the lived reality of domestic workers still in South Africa, in that they actually are not able to touch those laws. Those laws are actually not accessible to them. And when we came before the Constitutional Court, we said this because it might sound like it makes sense, but it's not something that is often brought before a court. Because while in this case, we can all agree that it was discrimination against domestic workers, we said to the court, we need to put a face to this. Because when you put a face to it, you put a black woman's face before the court. We're not an invisible group. Domestic workers is not a random group of women in society. There's a very particular historical background. And this is what we term the intersectional lens, when using an intersectional lens before a court and within the law. Because when you use the law on its own, without this lived reality and context, we can come up with judgments that still have these gaps in implementation, which even we still reflect on in Sihlangu, even though that intersectionality and lived reality was brought before the court. But we came before the court with this context because while we understand that it was discrimination based on what? When we look at the intersectionality, it's discrimination based on race because it's a black woman. But it's also discrimination based on gender, also then based on socioeconomic background. Because it's not a black woman from a particular area, it's a black woman from a particular socioeconomic background. And why is that important? Because as we've heard throughout the keynote, the introduction, and Sis Pinky, historically, work of black women are deemed undervalued, underpaid, yet it's the backbone of our society. That's not unintentional. That was placed that way intentionally for us to discard the work of black women. And so it was important for us to remind the court of that. And the court highlighted that even within its judgment, because it then said, yes, so this is discrimination, but actually actually, when you use an intersectional lens, what we realize is that this discrimination is aggravated. It's actually exacerbated. And that is what lived reality and context brings before the court. It's that understanding. And so a few other issues that I want to touch on that we brought before the court, because that answers your question about the gap still in implementation of law, is that we said, okay, great. So the court has now recognized that this is discrimination. And it's included domestic workers. But does the law go further in understanding context in this particular instance? Because COIDA, and we've made submissions to the COIDA amendment bills as well. We were there doing oral submissions and written submissions. However, the laws still speak about, for example, a dependent being able to claim should their breadwinner have been injured or passed away during the work of employment. But what does dependent mean in an African context? Once again, lived reality and context is important. Because while the law sees dependent and have termed it as someone who is at a certain age and then still in tertiary education, once again, we need to put race and gender and socioeconomic background, because we know in families of color, dependency looks very different. There's a context. If you are from a poor working class family, the likelihood of me attending tertiary education is not high. In fact, it's the opposite. In fact, the likelihood and the statistics show that I may have dropped out from school to assist within the home, to take care of other siblings, while my mother may be the sole beneficiary and breadwinner for the family. So there, the law discriminates once again. So we've included domestic workers, but then are we truly including domestic workers if we don't take that lived reality and context into question? Same with dependents, in the way that dependents are termed as spouses for a lot of benefits within the law. Once again, let's take the African context into consideration of a Black woman in a Black family, because there we also know the difficulties that come in with dependency in relation to life partners and spouses, and the differentiation between that. So once again, context and lived reality, we say, must always be at the forefront, because then we understand that the law may say dependence, but actually all Black women's children are going to be excluded as domestic workers, because I'm not in a tertiary education. I'm actually at home taking care of my children or my other siblings, and as was in the case of Sihlangu, was the sole breadwinner for her major child who was not able to access that benefit. So these are the importance of considerations of lived reality, context, and intersectionality, which sound like, you said, we don't like to use these big words that sound like they're nuanced in the law. But when we look at it very simply, it talks about seeing a woman for where she is in her position in society. Because then we don't look at domestic workers as a broad category of women. We place a domestic worker from a poor working class family within a society because of her race and because of the work that she does, and that's not accessible to her. And so these are some of the arguments that we sought to kind of highlight in the Sihlangu case before the Constitutional Court, to have the court understand the importance of judgment and the importance of using an intersectional lens within its judgments to give effect to substantive equality. But then we touch further on education and awareness, which was actually something we also raised within the court. And while there were pronunciations on, for example, the fact that education and awareness should sit within the government's responsibility and within the department, once again, if you're going to look at a department saying, we have done education and awareness, in what language? Where is it placed? So if there was a notice about Sihlangu, and if there was a notice, for example, now about accessibility to the fund, where was that notice placed? And after this judgment, we actually looked around and we saw a notice. So I'm from the Western Cape, and there's the Century City Mall, and there was a notice in the top bathroom. Just before you go into the bathroom, there was a notice. And we saw it at night, but once again, lived reality. Because like Sis Pinky illustrated, where's the domestic worker? She's in the employer's home until 11 at night. And then she either has to travel home or she sleeps in to wake up at 4 for that family. She's not at the mall. So she doesn't see that poster. And if she sees that poster, what language is the poster in? So it's those considerations of placing the woman where she is in society, because then we understand that discrimination impacts me in various ways because of my race, because of my socioeconomic background, and in this case, because of my profession. Another instance that was highlighted within the case is retrospectivity. The judgment is progressive. It's really progressive, and that's why it's so important that we take evaluation and stock of that, because the judgment and law was progressive, but the lived reality we circle full back on. Where is that even now in relation to retrospectivity and women bringing those claims forward? And these themes are all intersected. It's intersected with education, it's intersected with awareness, and it's intersected with the gaps in implementation. And these are just to touch on some of the things that we sought to highlight in our intervention in this case.
Thank you. I want you to look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, the law must work for you. I need you to do it with a little bit more conviction than that. Say, neighbor, the law must work for you. And I think that is the key takeaway I'm really taking from Chrissy's input, to say that the law can't just sit as a neutral player. It needs to be cognizant and sensitive to the lived realities of those who are sitting on the peripheries of social, economic, and political processes. And so when you speak about the progressiveness of this particular judgment and its ability to at least take into consideration the very multifaceted nature of the profession, but just of the working class population more broadly, it also calls on us as activists in this room to make sure we disseminate this information. In our WhatsApp groups, Batong, Ariwenka Koida, I know Satsau, I know Izwi, I know Black Womxn Caucus, I know Udosa, you have WhatsApp groups. Please type on that WhatsApp group right now that the law must work for you, #Koida. Yeah, I want to see comrades take their phones out. Yeah? Because this is how we need to make sure people understand what is happening. We're not going to wait for some big thing, we start now. With that being said, I want to move on to our government representative. And often in engagements like these, the government is seen as the #1 enemy. And I really want to challenge us to maybe tweak that thinking a little bit, to see the government as a partner of implementation, but also as a strategic partner in the process of accountability. Because part of taking stock, and that's really why we're here 2 years later since the announcement of this judgment, part of taking stock also requires us to engage in a process of accountability. Nomzamo spoke about the fact that since the announcement of this judgment, 7 claims, 5 have been deemed successful. There's something fundamentally wrong about those numbers. It's almost like, are we not doing the work, or are we doing the work? You know? And I think from government's perspective, what we are interested in finding out is, what do you think the barriers, what are the perceptions? Because if we have these instruments that are open and available to the people, why are the claims so low? You know? But before I give you an opportunity to answer, I'm going to follow due process and read her bio. Nokuthula Sihlangu is the director in the Compensation Fund, an entity of the Department of Employment and Labor. She is responsible for the claims processing, which entails the registration of claims, payment of short-term benefits, as well as the payment of pensions to qualifying employees. Nokuthula, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
I know I like this audience, eh? I like it.
Thank you for having me. I'm not, can you give me some order? Is this thing on? Is it on? Can I borrow your mic then? Is this better? I'm soft-spoken, so whoever is controlling the sound, if they can give me more volume. I'm Nokuthula Sihlangu, as they already indicated. I'm excited about this opportunity. I think this is the 4th or 5th time I'm engaging in this fashion. It may be a different forum altogether, but it's the same partners. I'm very happy about that, especially because it's my duty to process claims or to make sure that people process claims. And we always share the same sentiments about the low rate of submission of claims. I've been part of a lot of advocacy sessions myself, where I was speaking to domestic workers, but I've realized that we don't know how to get hold of domestic workers. In one engagement where we engaged domestic workers, before we even finished the advocacy session, they were all gone, you know, because they had to rush to work, otherwise they're gonna lose their jobs. So it's clear that we have to come up with a different approach when we want to reach out to domestic workers. I'm excited. I had an engagement with one of the unions of the domestic workers. I can't remember the name. Yes, but I see my colleagues are there. And at least then it was a forum for domestic workers, and at least we were speaking with the right audience. It's also a concern for me that domestic workers are us, but we're not complying. I think we must stop pointing too far as if the domestic employers are too far. We are domestic workers, and we are the ones who are not advancing the rights of domestic workers by ensuring that we register with the compensation fund as well as the UIF and get as much information as possible. I want to believe that domestic employers can read and write, and they can also take information home to people who are assisting their children to even do their homework. You know, as I'm sitting here, there's somebody taking care of my children at home, and for that reason, I have a responsibility to ensure that they're always informed about their rights where compensation fund is involved. Now, the compensation fund is an institution that collects revenue from employers and pays to injured employees. Now, an employer is the only policy holder. I think this is one thing that has to be made clear. An employer is the sole policy holder in the compensation fund. We're different from the UIF in that in the UIF, the employer and the employee contribute towards the fund, and when the employee loses their job, they are able to present themselves without the assistance of the employer. In the compensation fund, we first need the policyholder who is an employer. Now that we spoke about less than 2,000 domestic employers that are currently registered, that tells you that we don't have policyholders in the compensation fund space who are domestic employers, and that needs to be rectified. Now, I hope you've done what I've done. I've made sure that in every social media platform, I've shared this broadcast so that people are able to get information, and hopefully that will assist us to improve the compliance rate. Now, just to speak with domestic employers to assist them to realize what are the benefits that they're cheating domestic workers of. Now, the first thing is medical aid. You know that in South Africa, our public sector is not so good when it comes to healthcare services. The compensation fund gives medical aid, and we pay according to tariffs that are approved by the minister, and we believe that they are always higher than any medical aid that exists out there. So if you don't report an accident that happened on duty that resulted in an injury of an employee, just bear with me, I think this is making my throat dry. Now, if you're not reporting an accident, you must realize that you are robbing a domestic worker of an opportunity of getting treated at the best facility available in our country. They don't have to queue in a public sector environment, but they can be treated anyway. In fact, the compensation fund pays from the ambulance that picks them up to all the treatment that they receive for the first 2 years. The first 2 years, you don't need any special approval, or, you know, if I can give an example, if you've got a medical aid and you're going to be hospitalized, in some instances they need to get authorization from your medical aid and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that in the first 2 years, once we receive and accept liability for a claim, the medical aid kicks in automatically without asking questions. You're treating a healthcare practitioner, doesn't always have to come to us and knock and say, I want to do this, can I do it? I want to administer this type of medication, can I go ahead, and so on. Now there is a reputation out there that we have that is very bad, that says the compensation fund is not honoring invoices. Now it's very important for us to register a claim before we can pay an invoice. If we're not able to accept liability for a claim, or if we're not aware of a claim, we won't be able to pay, because first of all, we must have a claim in the compensation fund space. And I think this is one issue that is plaguing injured employees, in that their employers are lax when it comes to registering claims. So it's not only in the domestic workers, workers space, but it's something that we have observed generically, that there's a low rate of compliance with regards to employers in general. Now, we also provide rehabilitation services. We're speaking about the fact that children are excluded and so on, but this has since changed. When it comes to children of beneficiaries of the of injured employees in the compensation fund, we're giving them access to education. We're paying for their tertiary education, and this is something that started in about 3 years ago. So we just need that information to go out. So that is part of vocational rehabilitation that we give. We also give the same access to education to injured employees. So, and that works better in that you may find that you are a domestic worker today who gets disabled and you can't perform your duties. Should you get a bursary from the compensation fund or get trained in whatever field that you require training, you may end up in a better off job that pays you more. But because we're not getting these cases registered, our people or injured employees will not be able to access these benefits. We also provide assistive devices. So in case you get amputated, or you lose hearing, or any other kind of disease or injury that would require you to be provided with an assistive device or a wheelchair, you know, all those type of things. The compensation fund medical aid covers for that. Now, if I can quickly talk to the benefits that we're paying. So while a domestic worker is injured and recovering from the injury, if it's a big injury, it may last up to 2 years. The Act says in 2 years we must decide whether the claim should continue to be treated as, or the injured employee should continue to be treated as somebody who's recovering, or can we make a decision on the extent of their disablement. Now, when you're still off sick and only booked off by the doctor, by the way, you should not book yourself off. Now, if you booked off by the doctor, we compensate for a minimum of 4 days if you're not getting paid, up to a period of 2 years without asking questions. But now, if you have a minor injury, you can't present yourself as if you have got a big injury and you're taking 2 years without going back to work. Now, the good thing about domestic workers is that we know that they work for multiple employers. Now, when they get injured and lose income, we take all their earnings into consideration. We take into account how much were you earning from employer 1, employer 2, employer 3, and we add that up and look at other benefits that you're getting. So for example, they're getting housing, others are getting food parcels. You know, our definition for earnings is the one that is based on the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. It's compensation in cash or in kind. Now, after doing that, we pay, like I said, we pay that benefit while you're recovering for up to a period of 2 years. That will be dependent on your doctor. And once your doctor decides that I've given him or her all the treatment that they require and they are fit to go back to work, and this is the extent of their impairment, we do a calculation to make a decision on whether we pay you what we call a PD lump sum, permanent disablement lump sum, or we pay a pension. So those who are rated from 1% to 30%, they get just one lump sum and that's it. And those who are above 31%, they get a pension for the rest of their lives. The good thing about the bill that will become an act very soon is that after the death of the injured employee who's receiving a pension, we're going to continue to pay their dependents regardless of whether they died as a result of the injury on duty or not. Now, I want to talk about a benefit that we call a constant care allowance. A constant care allowance is a benefit that we pay for to people who can't do essential functions for themselves, who can't bath themselves, brush their teeth, and it's normally based on the recommendation of the doctor, or our internal practitioners also make a review of a client and recommend that they be given that kind of a benefit. That benefit is an addition in addition to other benefits that you'll be receiving in the compensation fund, and it's paid to the injured employee. Now we've got benefits that we pay to, we've got other benefits that we're paying to dependents of deceased employees that are payable to spouses and their children. I also want to address the issue of a prescription, because I think it's a contentious issue. The COID Act protects an injured employee. So it's not correct and accurate to believe that a claim expires within 12 months. But we look at whether did the employer fail to report after getting a report from an employee in the prescribed manner. If we discover that the employee did report the incident to the employer, but the employer didn't report to the compensation fund, we take the side of the injured employee and compensate the employee. Can I stop there for now? I think other information will be shared during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, maybe some of my own initial reflections on Sis Nokuthula's inputs is that, wow, it sounds so good in an ideal world. And I think we must be very honest, because unfortunately, I think the big barrier between being able to access these benefits and these services is the fact that this work is not even recognized, And so even though we understand that government's responsibility, the state's responsibility, is to create this enabling legislative environment, but I think an even bigger responsibility is to ensure that this legislative environment is even responsive. Because my worry is that I'm sitting and I'm thinking, wow, all of this is available, but who is it available to? And I think that is the question we need to ask, And that is not just a question for you, by the way, but it's a question for everyone here to say, as we look, it's 2 years gone. We've got COIDA now. How do we move forward? Right? How do we ensure that this law actually works for us, and institutions such as yours are able to respond to the needs of the people that they claim to serve? As indicated, unfortunately, Jacqueline from UN Women was unable to join us due to technical glitches. But I had prepared some briefing or some probing notes or pointers that I wanted to share with her. Comrades, I just want to reaffirm that the ask for the recognition of domestic work is not an ambitious ask. I just want to put it there. It's very much attainable. It's so attainable. I want to tell you how attainable it is, right? It's so attainable that South Africa is currently the global co-lead on the Action Coalition on Economic Justice and Rights in the UN's Generation Equality Forum. This is a global campaign that was launched last year in Paris, right? That has heads of states, businesses, development partners, all singing that we need to accelerate gender equality, right? We all know we've got the SDGs 2030, ne? But I want to tell you even more how attainable it is. Part of South Africa's mandate at a global level is to advocate for the full recognition of care work in its entirety. So South Africa has gone out globally as a co-lead alongside Kenya and has stood on a global platform and says we are putting our hands up, that we are going to drive this global campaign for the recognition of care work. And when we think about care work, we think about the domestic workers, we think about the community health care workers, we think about the social workers, you know, the child care workers. These are all professions that are largely feminized. They're dominated by working class Black women. Okay. And so the tools are there. The promises have been made. We just need to be able to hold our leaders accountable. Another interesting development is that in the same year COIDA judgment was made, is the same year where Africa declared the decade 2020 to 2030 as the decade of women's financial and economic inclusion. We cannot speak about women's economic inclusion without addressing the issue of care work. We can't speak about economic inclusion without speaking about the recognition, and not just recognition, guys, but the adequate compensation of this work that we do. So the tools are there. The instruments are literally sitting that here in our face. We just need to be able to equip ourselves so that we hold those in power accountable. And ultimately, I'm saying that the work that's happening in South Africa on COIDA should be a springboard into the global movement of domestic workers, asking and demanding for better working conditions and better recognition and compensation. As I said earlier on, that the fight for domestic workers is not just domestic workers, comrades. We're speaking about a new world order. We're speaking about an equitable world order that is premised on the principles of transformation, inclusion, sustainability, and most importantly, human dignity. So yes, 2 years have gone by. The desired outcomes are, 7 claims. We're not saying that we want people to be injured in the workplace, but we want people to be able to make use of the resources and instruments that are available to them. So as we think about the journey, the years moving forward, I want us to think that it's attainable. We're not asking for something difficult. With that being said, I would like to open up for questions, comments. I know the mics are going to do a round in the room. I urge you, when you do ask your question or make your comment, please stand, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and then you can proceed. Okay, we're gonna start off with a round of 5 hands. I also just want to promote language justice. So whatever language you feel most comfortable in expressing yourself, please go ahead. So can you just lift your hand so I can note you? Okay. Hey, these hands are tricky. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's 1, black and white, 2, Mam Eunice, 3, 4, Ma'am Flo, and 5. Okay.
Number 1. Number 1.
Amandla
Awethu,
amandla
awethu,
phambili ngedomestika phambili.
phambili.
Good evening everyone. My name is Hannah Kaisa from Izwi Domestic Workers. I am a migrant domestic worker. My question is directed to Nokuthula. I just want to know if the government finds out that I reported to my employer when I got injured and he or she didn't take it into consideration, what does it do? Thank you.
Number 2 at the back was Ma'am Uni was number 2 and
Amandla,
Awethu,
Mandla,
awethu,
viva Satsau, viva,
viva,
viva Udosa, viva,
viva,
viva Izwi, viva,
viva,
Black Womxn Caucus, viva,
viva,
Amandla.
awethu.
Thank you very much. First of all, Nokuthula, I wish I could invite you to the domestic workers meeting to explain whatever you has been explained here, because your explanation was very sweet. So I wish workers can also listen to it and ask some questions about it. It's okay. Lo okulumayo uYunisladla from Satsau. Satsau is a South African domestic service and allied workers union. As Upinki Eshilo, we are coming far, no Pinky. I always call Upinki my production. Uyazi nayo ukuthi why ngisho njalo. Work hand in glove nalo no Pinky. So comrades, it will be a comment together with a lament, because we cannot stop lamenting. As really gone are those days where a worker wasn't recognized as a worker. But there are still those employers who doesn't care. Pinky says there are some employers who are good, but they are few. We need employers to be really employers. When are you as an employer will recognize that a worker is very important for you? In the morning you wake up, employer. I'm saying that in the morning because I know there are employers around with us here, black or white. In the morning you wake up and leave your house in tatters. When you come back, your house is sparkling clean. Who cleaned it? Why, employer, you're waiting for the Department of Labor to tell you to pay this worker? What is wrong with you? Can't you see that this is a very important somebody whom I got here in my house? Who takes your children to school, to creches? Who fetch them? Who cook for them? Who bathed this child? It's this domestic worker, but you don't want to give her a living wage. If a worker gets a living wage, or maybe a little bit more better, let me say 3,000, that worker will work, ngesiZulu we say, uzoze eme ngekhandi inyawo ibheke phezulu.
It's true.
Because she's getting a living wage. That is not the way. A worker must earn what she or he is entitled to. Madam and master, where is your soul? Where is your Ubuntu? Because this person is a human being, same as you. As the other speaker in front says, the children of these employers, they prefer you as auntie or mama than their mothers, because they know how do they get from you. They get love. They get to be protected. You always with them. But you, umama wakona, doesn't see that. Please, employers, recognize these workers as human beings. They also need money to live. They got children, they got aunties in their home whom are looking for their children. And they need to go to school, they need to eat, they need to be fed. So please recognize us. Amanda.
Away too. Thank you. Thank you, comrades. Number 3, 4, and 5, please be on standby. But I've also been alerted that time is not on our side, so I'm going to ask that we keep it very concise and short. You can go.
Good evening, everyone. Lebitso la ka ke Maria Thupa. Potso ya ka ke shebisitse ho Nokuthula. Aus Nokuthula ke kopa ho botsa hore na ese lone le batho ba molao le tlo etsa jwang hore bahiri ba rone ba re register ho kwaida, because ba ntse ba hloleha hore register ho UIF ke ne le tlo tla etsa. Ke thank you.
Thank you. Ke kopa number 4, Mam Flo, there she is. Makoska. Igama la makoskazi.
My name is Florence Bolani. I would like to apologize. I'm not going to be standing on the EF's platform today. I'm going to be standing on BWC. When we speak of an image of a domestic worker, we see a black. When we speak of a domestic worker, we see a black woman who is struggling. Our bodies as black women, they're fighting a lot of struggle that no one else understood. People I don't know what it is.
As I was saying, when you see an image of a domestic worker, you visualize a black person. Our bodies as black women, they're fighting a lot of struggles that our employers doesn't even understand them. They've got the privilege to go and see physio, massage therapist, as we don't, because we are here facing whatever the mess they made. Domestic workers are being looked at as this iron fist woman who has more power than their husband. Recently, I was waiting because for my salary raise, of which is usually coming on the effect of the November during the domestic worker week. And then I see nothing is happening. And then I went and asked, after how many years do I have to wait for my salary raise? Because since 2018, I was answered to say, since you're earning more than the living wage, you are not entitled, or you don't, access the pay rise. And I looked at her and asked her, but when I look at the prices go up, they don't accommodate a domestic worker. I don't have to walk in the shop and wear a badge and say I'm a domestic worker so that they can recognize me or they can lower down the prices. Yeah, it's the same platform, what I buy, what they buy.
When I asked for that, I brought myself a lot of conversation, the plans, that they are denying me that they will be immigrating to other countries that will accommodate them more better when they are in their elderly age, of which they are denying me when I'm asking by underpaying me so that I can get benefit or maybe a saving so that I can also access to that when I get to my elderly age. So we were excited that we are involved in a minimum wage. There's COIDA. First we fought to be recognized, then there's COIDA, then there's COVID. They decided for us in COVID, and then now they are throwing that in our faces and say, I was paying you, but you never sit down with me and discuss it with me. Which way do you want it to happen? I'm here today being emotional and like broken because I was denied that raise because I earn more than minimum wage. Since we are involved in the minimum wage, who is entitled to get their salary raise for every year? And why are we still being left behind? Well, at least they say they're involving us. So it is the fight that is still there. It is the fight that is still need to be looked at. We can have conversation. Only a few of good employers, or maybe some of them want to understand what exactly it is. But we are being denied. We are being left behind. Recently, I went with Comrade Jane to Bekezela settlement. Everybody in that room was crying, seeing the women in that area. Because we black women, we have poor black hands, and that's for poor, that's for hardship, and that's paid less, that's paid slavery pay and slavery hours, so that you're not gonna get access to be able to learn other things. You will be questioned for being late for half an hour, that you're owing me for that half an hour because I'm paying you. It is heartbreaking. Thank you for this event, but I believe that for those who are listening, let's not end it here. Let's not sit there and say we're having a conversation because we are here. Let's not, saying I spoke and they nodded their head. I want to see change. I want to see change affecting. I want to see somebody say, okay, this is what happened to me when the conversation happened. This is what happened to me when I was included. When I went there, I saw change and change came to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ma'am Flo. And you have a last one. Yeah. Unfortunately.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maggie Mtombeni. I'm from Izwi Domestic Workers Alliance. My first question is going to Nelson Mandela Foundation and SERI. Did you guys invite the employers' organization in this event? That's my first question. And then it's not a question, this is a question. And then my second thing is a comment about domestic workers, employers, because most of the times we do have most of event like this, but we usually have domestic workers and domestic workers representative without domestic workers employers. And then we're not going anywhere because on COIDA, it's only employers who are supposed to register their domestic workers. And then it's also only employers who are contributing. It's also only employers who are claiming on behalf of a domestic worker. So we are always in the rooms with domestic workers only. And then I would like to thank Isatau, I would like to thank SERI, I would like to thank Pinky as individual. And then I also like to thank Udosa for always being there for everything. But Pinky is a special thing just for Pinky, not Udosa. There is Udosa and then there is Pinky, which is two different things. Yes. And then the other thing is, why are you done? The other thing is, as in this room now, my question is, as I can see, we do have domestic workers and domestic workers employers. Are you guys employers registered your domestic workers on COIDA and UIF? in the room, because most of the times we do have employers here next to us, but they are holding the flag. They are not raising the flag. They are holding the flag. They are not raising the flag. And then they're supposed to preach what they're doing. Because as an employer, you do have family and friends. And then you have to lead by example. You can't come out from this room without registering your domestic worker and expect to tell your neighbor to register her or his domestic worker. You think it's going to work? We are always having domestic workers, employers next to us. And then in this room today, there are many. But if you go one by one, in those who are here, most of them, they are domestic workers, they are not registered. So we're going to be busy preaching what we are not doing. So how, if domestic workers like Department of Labor can enforce domestic workers, employers to register them on COIDA, because it's even still difficult for domestic workers to be registered under UIF while they are also contributing on UIF. But on COIDA, it's only employers who are contributing. You think it's going to be easy for employers to register their domestic workers on COIDA while they can't register their domestic workers on UIF, knowing that a domestic worker is also contributing 1% on UIF, but on COIDA, only employers are supposed to contribute. So I think we have to start from ground. While domestic workers, employers, they're supposed to be educated. My last question still is, do we have any domestic workers, employers organization in the room? If we do, I think we're supposed to engage them on everything which we're doing so that they can preach and then they can educate their clients about registering their domestic workers in Department of Labor on COIDA and UIF. And then the other thing, I think if SERI and Nelson Mandela Foundation can invite domestic workers organizations to be one of the panelists there, because I think that is the best thing to do, to start on, because if you can preach to tell me as a domestic worker to be registered, I'm supposed to go and tell my employer. It's difficult for me to tell my employer that I'm asking for the increase. It's going to be more difficult for me to tell my employer to be registered on UIF and COIDA. So I think we're supposed to educate domestic workers, employers, organization to educate their clients. Thank you.
Thank you. Comrades, unfortunately, I'm going to close the formal aspect of Q&A, but I will invite us during our dinner to really engage some of the panelists, right? I know some wanted to ask questions and they may have not had an opportunity to do so in this round. But I also just want to use this opportunity to give our panelists, there's been more comments than there have been questions. And of course, also Nokuthula, you are the person who is receiving most of the questions as anticipated. But as you guys, provide your closing remarks, I want you in your closing remarks to touch on some of the issues that have been raised from the floor, but also most importantly, in an ideal world, what does the short, immediate strategy look like? And what does the long-term strategy look like from your perspective as a unionist, as a legal practitioner, as a government official? Because most importantly, we need to know, So I'm going to ask that Nokuthula, you start to, so in your closing remarks.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to say is that all the issues that were echoed, I've registered them, and I'm going to be writing a report to the Commissioner and the DG. So some of the issues require reaction from our inspection and enforcement services side, and we're going to make sure that they get that information. Now, the compensation fund doesn't wait for the employer to register. So remember what I need to clarify that. I said there must be a policy holder. That doesn't mean that when you are injured, we're gonna say we're waiting for the policy holder to come through. We are able to assist domestic workers. We are linked to the UIF system. We are able to see if you are registered and assist you to register a claim on our side. The minister is also implementing minimum and maximum benefits for low-income earners, to make sure that even if you have a very low salary, but when you're injured, you're pushed to a level that is far much higher. We also get assisted by healthcare providers. So when they treat you, make sure you mention that you were injured at work. They do trigger claims in that format. I am always available to communicate with domestic workers as well as employees. Contact me. If I'm not able to attend a physical meeting, make sure that I can be able to engage with you virtually. Thank you.
So in closing, I think I want to, based on the comments and the questions that came from the room, I want to start by pointing the finger at myself, our organization, as we work introspectively to look at how, because I mean, there's obviously an evident feeling in the room that the law has not worked. The judgment has not become a lived reality for many. And so it's an introspection about how we work collaboratively. And we applaud SERI for bringing organizations and stakeholders together in that regard. But then I want to implore myself and other practitioners in the civil society sector to think about how we be creative about implementing this law. There was a question about accountability of employers. There are other aspects in other areas of law where there are instances where you could hold employers personally accountable and liable when they don't comply with certain laws. What do we do in this instance? Because there's a gap and the numbers show us that. I want to touch on lived reality because the laws and the provisions that have been outlined sound amazing, and I want to make an example of this because we're talking about just and favorable work conditions for all women who work in precarious conditions. If I experience sexual harassment as a domestic worker within my workplace, even though the law says that for sexual harassment, I can make those complaints anonymously, that those complaints can be treated in certain ways, how do I make a complaint anonymously when I'm the only person in my workplace? And so that indicates to us the stark gap in the implementation of law and protection for women who work in vulnerable conditions, precarious conditions where there is little to no oversight because I'm in a private home. And so I want to implore us to introspect, work together, collaborate, but think about how we work and use methodologies outside of the law to complement it to achieve substantive equality. Thank you.
I would like to touch on enforcement. Can you hear me? Yes. That is Nokuthula. There are many labor officials who don't know anything about COIDA. There was a domestic worker in Bloemfontein this year was told that domestic workers are not covered by COIDA. So we need more training on labor officials to know how to deal with domestic workers' cases. There was another labor official who told the domestic worker that there's nothing he can do if the employer doesn't want to register her with the UIF. He can't force her. Here in Randburg, I told the domestic worker to get the name of the official, but she never came back to me. So I also have a word of advice to domestic workers. Please report each and every injuries. Even if you can fall and think that maybe it's nothing, report to your employer. You don't know that what might happen to you after some time. And also, those arthritis, when you go to clinics, tell them that you are working with water. Because at the end of the day, your employers will say they don't know you. And I want to say something about the Labor Department when coming to employers as policy holders. Is as if they are saying to domestic workers, more especially on retrospectivity. This is the COIDA that the Constitutional Court gave it to you, and we're going to make it very difficult for you to benefit from it. Where am I going to get the employer who has relocated, an employer who emigrated to America if I was injured in 2013? How am I going to get? I have information that I was shot at work, and the papers, the documents at the hospital are saying that Pinky was injured at work. They broke into the employer's house. That's how Pinky was killed. But the Labor Department is saying the employer is a policyholder. The employer is in Switzerland. The employer is somewhere overseas. How am I going to benefit from that? Really, I think Department of Labor must go back to the drawing board and sit down and look at this. We have a case, I spoke about it since Nokuthula in Pretoria, of Mariam Caesar who was shot at work and died. The employer was airlifted. The employer is not the South African. She was on newspapers, her story is there, but because the employer is the policyholder, is the family of Mariam Caesar going to benefit from compensation fund? Who's going to fill the forms? Because the employer, as we speak, he left the country, he cannot tolerate this crime here. He nearly died himself, he was airlifted, they were both shot at, unfortunately Maria died. So there's still work. Actually, we need the minister. Can you please take this message to Minister Thulas Nxesi that domestic workers are asking to see him?
Thank you. Guys. Thank you so much to our speakers for a very insightful conversation, really giving meaning to collective responsibility. Pinky just said something really profound about, what's the point if the law can't work for me? It's there, but I can't use it. And I think when we say neighbor, the law must work for us, we are really meaning in a very literal sense. But we have come to the end of a phenomenal panel discussion. I want to close off with some sentiments to say that it is still 16 days of activism for no violence against women and children. We do know that domestic workers continue to experience a lot of sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. We know South Africa has come, as per usual, put their hand up high and said, we are going to rectify the IOL 190 convention. But things are not changing, comrades, and that's the reality. This year's theme for 16 days of activism speaks on women's socio-economic empowerment and its ability to prevent us, or rather to minimize our vulnerability to violence. So when we're speaking about the experiences of domestic workers, and we're speaking about the fact that they need to be compensated the right way, that we want just and fair working conditions, we're also saying that we don't want to see GBVF in our workplace. We are tired, enough is enough. So as we continue with 16 days of activism, we say, in the words of Nomzamo, that we are leaving no women behind because all women matter. From myself, Keitumetse Fatimata Moutloatse, the feminist social worker, it's been an absolute pleasure to hold the space and be with you guys today. Thank you.
Can we just please give another warm round of applause to our We're at the end of our program for the day, but I thought something that stood out that needs to be reiterated is that employers of domestic workers also need to learn about the responsibility they have towards protecting the rights of domestic workers. And fortunately for us, SERI has actually prepared a document to assist and inform what it is that they can do, and it's available online on their website. They have QR codes available tonight for people to grab downstairs when they are having their supper. Use the information that is there, and if there's something that's not clear, you can ask SERI and they'll be able to answer you on your questions. As I close off, I would like to thank firstly everyone for joining us today for this discussion, to the people in the room, the people who joined us online. We don't take it for granted that you sacrificed a lot of things to be with us here today, and the fact that the conversation necessitated the presence that is here. So thank you very much for that. I would also like to thank the unions who are present with us, the activists, civil society organizations, employers and employers organizations, government officials, and most importantly, the staff of SERI and the Nelson Mandela Foundation for pulling together this discussion. Thank you very much. And in closing, the supper available downstairs. You can just go down the steps here. There'll be people waiting for you there. Please enjoy. Join us. This also creates another avenue and platform for conversation. So if you had questions you couldn't ask during the Q&A session, you're more than welcome to ask. I think our panelists have made themselves available, and everyone who's here, you can ask your questions. They'll be able to share insights and offer much more input than they could before. Thank you very much.